On Tuesday, November 18th, the American outlet Axios reported that the United States is once again working on a new iteration of its peace proposal aimed at ending the Russian-Ukrainian war. The 28-point plan is arguably the most comprehensive framework for a potential settlement put forward so far. It includes provisions on territorial division, possible war reparations, the future structure of Ukraine's armed forces, and crucially, security guarantees. I am optimistic about it, Kirill Dmitriev, representing the Russian side, told Axios. Are we witnessing the moment that, after nearly 4 years of full-scale war, could lead to a ceasefire and a quote, peace of sorts? A number of factors shaping the current geopolitical environment suggest that this attempt may indeed have the highest chance of success among all initiatives pursued by the Trump administration to date. So is peace just around the corner? Let's examine the proposed plan and the clouds of uncertainty surrounding it. Attacks on refineries and the resulting turmoil in the fuel market are yet another reminder of how quickly geopolitical events can spill over into the global economy. Moments like this show just how closely financial markets are tied to political and energy sector tensions. That is why I have been using XTB for years. That has become the core of my own financial toolkit at home. XTB helps me follow global trends, compare sectors, and react when timing matters most. Inside the app, I have access to over 8,400 stocks and ETFs from around the world, and I can invest commission-free up to €100,000 in monthly turnover. Transactions above this limit will be charged a commission of 0.2%. That gives me the freedom to explore different areas, from energy and raw materials to the defense sector, all the way to tech companies shaping the future. XTB lets you make decisions based on knowledge rather than emotion, thanks to many educational materials. And in today's world, that makes all the difference. But remember that investing always involves risk. Work on the draft peace agreement was once again led by Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff, assisted by President's son-in-law Jared Kushner. The pair has recently enjoyed a wave of positive media coverage for their proposed Gaza peace plan, but whether that plan is a real success remains to be seen. Emboldened, they turned their attention to the Russian-Ukrainian file. Their main interlocutor on the Russian side was Kirill Dmitriev, head of Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund. The talks took place largely during Dmitriev's visit to Miami between October 24th and 26th. The plan leaked to the media on November 18th, almost certainly for the Russians. Under Axios' post, Steve Witkoff accidentally commented that the leak had come from Mr. K, almost certainly a reference to Kirill Dmitriev. On November 20th, Axios obtained access to the substantive provisions of the draft. Neither the Ukrainians nor the Europeans took part in these initial discussions. In Washington's vision, they were meant to join only at a later stage. Unsurprisingly, this fact was met with irritation in Paris and Berlin. After all, it is Europe that is currently keeping Ukraine in the war. A few days later, on November 23rd, Europe responded to the American initiative during a meeting in Geneva. Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, the so-called E3, coordinated the response. The Swiss talks included not only the E3 but also American representatives, among them Rubio and Witkoff, as well as Ukrainian officials, Andriy Yermak and Rustem Umerov. Let's now turn to the plan itself and outline its provisions, while integrating the European amendments as we go. We should also keep in mind that everything we are discussing remains at a high level of abstraction. The most consequential elements will inevitably lie in the details. The agreement opens with a confirmation of Ukraine's sovereignty and a non-aggression pact to be signed by Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. Here, Europe proposes an amendment expanding the pact to include NATO as well. In the original draft, Russia pledges not to attack neighboring states, and in exchange, NATO would halt further enlargement, a provision the E3 removed entirely. The United States, meanwhile, positions itself as a mediator between Russia and NATO, a role Europe struck out, replacing it with more neutral language. Point 5 states that Ukraine is to receive reliable security guarantees. This is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most crucial elements of the entire plan. Barak David of Axios obtained the more concrete provisions. The guarantees are meant to resemble Article 5 of NATO, but according to legal experts, the similarity is largely cosmetic. In practice, the guarantees would not obligate anyone to take action. They remain discretionary and lack binding force. Therefore, the E3 response replaced the word reliable with robust, a shift meant to imply a stronger, more binding commitment from NATO. Moving forward, Ukraine was expected to reduce its armed forces to 600,000 troops in peacetime. In the European version, this figure is raised to 800,000. Points 7, 8 and 9 concern NATO. Ukraine would be required to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join the alliance. Europe alters the spirit of this clause, stating instead that Ukraine's accession depends solely on NATO consensus, something that at present does not exist. In point 8, the US draft requires NATO to pledge that it will not send troops to Ukraine. The Europeans clarified that NATO won't deploy troops permanently, but they allow for a rotational presence. Point 9 states in a strikingly vague manner that, quote, European fighter jets will be stationed in Poland, a line viewed with considerable concern in Warsaw, which interprets it as a veiled attempt to restrict NATO troops on Polish soil while permitting only air assets. The E3 keeps that point and modifies only one word, replacing European with NATO. Continuing through the document, the US plan stipulates that if either side breaks the agreement, consequences will follow. Sanctions on Russia would be reinstated, and a military response might be considered. Washington also seeks compensation for providing its security guarantees. The E3, however, explicitly adds that US guarantees must mirror Article 5. Ukraine is to remain on its path toward European Union membership, a point to which the Europeans raise no objections. Its reconstruction would be coordinated, in part, through a new Ukrainian Development Fund. Russia, meanwhile, is to be reintegrated into the global economy, including a phased lifting of sanctions and cooperation with the United States in energy, natural resources, and AI. Moscow would return to the G8, a provision left largely unchanged by the Europeans. The original US draft states that of the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets, $100 billion should be redirected to Ukraine's reconstruction, with 50% of the profits going to the United States. Europe would contribute another $100 billion, while the remaining $200 billion would be invested in a joint American-Russian, quote, investment vehicle. Here we can see a clear, though unstated, irritation of Europe. Not only would the EU cover half of Russia's reparations, but European frozen assets would be used to fund US-Russian projects. And the idea of Washington receiving 50% of the profits from rebuilding Ukraine raises eyebrows. Profits from what, exactly? The E3 deletes the entire section and replaces it with a single principle, quote, Ukraine will be fully reconstructed and compensated financially, including through Russian sovereign assets that will remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine, unquote. The E3 accepted points 15 to 20 with only minor adjustments. The plan first outlines a joint body that would oversee implementation of the agreement, though the original version excluded Ukrainians and Europeans, leaving oversight solely to the United States and Russia. Next, Russia is to legislate a commitment of non-aggression toward both Europe and Ukraine. The US and Russia would resume cooperation on preventing nuclear proliferation, while Ukraine would not pledge to pursue nuclear weapons. Electricity from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant would be split evenly between Russia and Ukraine. Point 20 consists of general commitments to tolerance and understanding. The next major controversy arises in point 21st, territory. In the original US-Russian draft, Crimea and the Luhansk and Donetsk regions would be fully recognized de facto as Russian. while the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions would be divided along the line of contact. The E3 pushes back here, refusing to concede the entire Donbas to Russia. Their version envisions division strictly along the existing line of contact. From there, both sides are to commit to renouncing any future military revanche, and Russia is to guarantee Ukraine free navigation on the Dnieper River. All prisoners of war and their remains are to be returned, including abducted children. Ukraine would hold elections within 100 days of peace, which the Europeans replace with the quote, as soon as possible. Another dispute concerns point 26, where the US proposes full amnesty for both sides. The E3 removes this entirely and inserts language on supporting victims. The next provision states that both parties accept a peace monitoring process overseen by a council chaired by Donald Trump, which the Europeans accept. The draft concludes with an immediate ceasefire. The E3 adds clarifying language on when exactly such a ceasefire would take effect. Ukrainians were given a deadline of November 27th to respond. As we can see, the US and Europe are treating this plan with considerable seriousness, and despite clear divergences in interest, the plan has a real chance of being implemented, if the decision rested solely with those two sides. Meanwhile, of course, the key actors remain Ukraine and Russia. Let's not indulge the illusion that Russia has changed its strategic goals toward Ukraine. Its objectives remain the same: total conquest and/or subjugation of Ukraine's leadership. Does the plan provide that? Even in the American version, it does not. What it does provide is a quote, window of opportunity that would allow Moscow to regroup. Reintegration into the global economy, renewed cooperation with the United States, weak security guarantees for Kyiv, and minimal reparations all create a scenario in which the Witkoff plan could serve as a window for Russia to rebuild its strength. That window could last 3, 5, or 10 years, after which Moscow may return for a rematch against Ukraine, or launch new aggression against other neighboring states. Given the deep destruction of its oil industry, and more broadly its economy, Russia may be well tempted by such an option, even if it currently enjoys battlefield momentum. The Kremlin's propagandists, despite failing to achieve the war's core objectives, and despite the catastrophic overall outcome for the country, would undoubtedly find a way to frame it as a victory at this stage of the conflict. This is why many speculate that the original version of the plan was in fact a Russian version, a theory reportedly confirmed by Senator Mike Rounds. It would also explain the distinctly Russian phrasing embedded in the first draft. Europe quickly recognized the dangers in the initial document and introduced significant revisions. Most importantly, it strengthened the security guarantees, creating real ambiguity over whether NATO might be compelled to intervene militarily should Russia break the deal. It also places substantial financial burdens on Russia for Ukraine's reconstruction and refuses to grant Moscow an automatic right to those parts of the Donbas still held by Kyiv. The E3 moreover removes any hint of blanket amnesty for Russian war crimes. And although even the European version still contains provisions that are politically difficult for Kyiv, for example the fact that Russia would be reintegrated into the global economy as if nothing had happened, it is highly likely that Zelenskyy would sign such a deal immediately. Because despite Ukraine's remarkable success in its long-range strikes campaign against Russian critical infrastructure, Kyiv faces growing frontline difficulties, whose root cause remains unchanged: chronic mobilization shortfalls and rising AWOL rates. The armed forces of Ukraine are holding the line with increasing strain, just as a difficult winter approaches. But that's not all. The timing of peace plan leak may be linked to another development. A few weeks ago, Ukraine was shaken by largest corruption scandal since the start of the war, centered on the state nuclear energy giant, Energoatom. Investigators from NABU uncovered that a criminal network connected to close associates of President Volodymyr Zelenskyy had been extorting kickbacks of up to 15% of contract values. The total fraud amounting to at least $100 million. Those implicated include Zelenskyy's longtime friend, Timur Mindic, former Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Chernyshov and former Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, the same Umerov who took part in the Geneva talks. Leaked wiretaps revealed the group's influence over key government appointments. And so evidence is beginning to implicate Zelenskyy's closest associates. The scandal also casts a shadow over the president himself, especially given his attempt in July this year to take control over NABU and destroying its independence, an effort halted only by mass street protests and firm US opposition. It is therefore entirely plausible that evidence may emerge implicating Volodymyr Zelenskyy, even if only in the form of shielding his allies. US intelligence services may well understand how weakened the Ukrainian president's negotiating position has become, which in turn increases the pressure Washington can exert. Perhaps for this reason, on November 21st, Zelenskyy delivered one of the most dramatic statements of the war. Quote, "We are now living through one of the most difficult moments in our history. Right now, Ukraine may face a very tough choice, either the loss of dignity or the risk of losing a key partner, either a difficult 28-point plan or an extremely harsh winter, the harshest one, and further risks ahead. A life without freedom, dignity and justice, and being forced to trust someone who has already attacked us twice. They will be waiting for our answer." And he goes on, "The next week will be tough. There will be a lot of pressure, political and informational, to try to break us apart and destabilize us." Unquote. These remarks may, though do not necessarily, hint that compromising evidence involving Zelenskyy could surface as the crisis unfolds. But some analysts, such as Yaroslav Trofimov, argue the opposite, that the scandal may actually make it harder for Kyiv to accept a peace plan, because the public might suspect Zelenskyy has been coerced into it. Even so, when all factors are taken together, the peace plan does appear to have a realistic chance of advancing. Even without the corruption angle, quiet discussions in diplomatic circles suggest that Ukraine may be prepared to accept major concessions, simply because its strategic position is increasingly dire, and without US support would deteriorate further. Andriy Yermak, himself potentially implicated, has spoken positively about progress on the draft, while noting that the final decision belongs to the presidents. This again places the likely fate of the agreement in Moscow's hands. And while the Witkov plan had been viewed as quote optimistic for the Kremlin, at least by Dmitriev, the E3's revised version contains numerous provisions that would be costly for Russia. And this suggests that once more, a major storm may produce only a drizzle. And yet we should not underestimate the catastrophic toll the war continues to take on Russia. Ukraine keeps chalking up successes. In November alone, it carried out 10 successful strikes on Russian refineries, and the share of refining capacity knocked offline still likely exceeds 30%. One thing is certain: whether in its original or revised form, this agreement would not remove the specter of war from Europe or Ukraine. It would suspend it, postpone it, but the Russian Federation, deep in its pro-war momentum, will continue seeking an outlet for its military pressure. The first Russo-Ukrainian war chapter would then give way to an era of military buildup.